Hey everyone, Antoni here. The other day I saw The Killing of a Sacred Deer at the cinema, the newest film from one of my favorite directors, Yorgos Lanthimos, a master of dark comedy as well as a man who, according to me, created one of the best modern art house films, Dogtooth, which holds a rather high place on the list of my all-time favorite films. His previous film, The Lobster, which is also on that list, as well as the list of my favorite films of 2015, is the film I'll be comparing to his newest work. Not because both of these films have Colin Farrell as the leading actor, but because they are his most recent works, one followed by the other, thus showcasing the consecutive stylistic flourish of Lanthimos as an auteur. Besides, I rewatched The Lobster the day before seeing this one at the cinema, so it's all very fresh in my mind and therefore suited for discussion. The Killing of a Sacred Deer follows a seemingly empathetic but mostly enigmatic surgeon named Stephen, who in the opening act of the film allocates a generous amount of care to a young teenager named Martin. The interactions between these two at first led me to believe this was just a rather troubled relationship between a father and a son, with the apprehensive attempts at bonding after perhaps a divorce that caused the family to separate. Soon after, however, it is revealed that Martin is not actually related to Stephen, initially giving off a somewhat uncomfortable vibe, which is partly eliminated through progressions that make everything seem completely fine after all. Fine in the sense of the cynical reality Lanthimos establishes here, as well as in his previous films. The general deadpan feeling in terms of the chemistry between characters is definitely a stylistic trait of his, which is why the formal and uneasy exchanges between Stephen and Martin at the beginning felt natural to me, not just because I could relate.
I brought you some little gifts.
That's very kind of you.
It's a keyring with a musical note on it for Kim, because I know she likes music.
What a charming boy. How long have you known him?
Quite some time. His father was a patient of mine.
So despite the uncomfortable vibe partly vanishing, there is a continuous sense of uncertainty, a constant expectation of something awful happening at any moment, and for a good reason. This feeling of dread was achieved entirely through the craft, the gloomy atmosphere set within this confined world that feels detached from the light of life, the subtle switches within the deadpan acting that suggest sinister intentions, and the minimal yet impactful use of music that effectively underlines the internal, external, and metaphorical wounds, all carried by the perfect pacing. Dread is entirely crafted, rather than expected given my familiarity with his previous films that do follow a similar narrative structure. The Lobster has pretty awful things happening throughout, but the worst things start happening in the second and third acts.
That's awful. Just awful.
Having a hand being forced into an active toaster as a punishment for masturbating is pretty damn cruel, and a helpless dog being kicked to death for no reason is even more cruel. However, Yorgos Lanthimos managed to step up the cruelty game even further in The Killing of a Sacred Deer. Because here, a family is presented with a dilemma that will result in death within their family no matter what choice they make. And somehow, Lanthimos managed to stay intact with his comedy game, which is simply astounding considering the levels of cruelty we're dealing with here. In fact, I would compare the general cruelty in this film to the cruelty in Funny Games. Just let that sink in. Yorgos managed to make such high levels of cruelty funny. I know, almost as cruel as me repeating the word cruelty so many times. A dark sense of humor is required either way if you want to get the full enjoyment out of these films. The attempted suicide of the biscuit lady in The Lobster was one of the funniest scenes for me, but I know people are generally more comfortable with laughing at suffering adults. The inclusion of children within any taboo, however, results in a significant increase of sensitivity in relation to controversy. And I'm generally quite a sensitive guy, so the fact Yorgos managed to make me laugh out loud multiple times given these tragic scenarios is pretty impressive. As I've mentioned briefly, the use of music here is generally more minimal in comparison to The Lobster, since the soundtrack there played a big part in terms of comedy as well as suspense. The music in The Killing of a Sacred Deer is more selective, and not as repetitive as in The Lobster, but as a result is less memorable. It does work perfectly fine though and achieves what it needs to achieve, so I don't hold anything against it, nor do I think that it hinders the film by not being particularly memorable. Both of these films provide more in different aspects, but it doesn't mean they're missing anything. The Lobster is a satire on the concept of love with the basis of idealized matchmaking, featuring more consistent comedy and overall providing a more memorable experience. Whereas The Killing of a Sacred Deer is a satire on the concept of a nuclear family in which love is spread around equally, providing a more thrilling and conclusive experience. Arguably the most crucial element that both films provide though are the great performances all around, with everyone having a tight grasp on simultaneously coming across as deadpan yet also emotionally expressive, which is one of the defining traits of Lanthimos' style that works wonders for the comedy. I'm still somewhat surprised by how such dark comedy managed to work so damn well. There is a very fine line between being pretentious for an overly pessimistic outlook and being genuinely smart as well as clearly life experienced by carefully crafting scenarios that on paper do sound unnecessarily cruel, but in execution are masterful. Obviously Lanthimos achieved the latter here with this film. The Killing of a Sacred Deer is daring, relentless, thrilling and hilarious. It is by all means a grotesque masterpiece.